Morning she laughed at my hands. I was standing at the kitchen counter slicing sourdough I'd baked the night before. Not store-bought, not a mix. I'd made it from a starter I'd been keeping alive for 11 years. Fed it every week through my wife Marion's illness, through the funeral, through the first winter alone. Bread was the one thing that kept me tethered to something that felt like purpose. My son had called 3 days before to say he was bringing Nadine home for dinner. Just a casual thing, Dad. Nothing fancy. I'd nodded on the phone like I understood what casual meant to a 63-year-old man who'd spent 31 years working underground. I set the table anyway, used the good plates, the ones with the blue ring around the edge that Marion had picked out at a shop in Stratford the year we got married. I put out cloth napkins. I made a roast, the kind that takes 4 hours and fills the whole house with the smell of garlic and thyme. I wasn't trying to impress anyone. I just didn't know how to do things halfway. They arrived at 6. My son Alec came through the door first. He'd gotten his mother's height and my stubbornness, which was not always a good combination. He looked tired in the way that men in their early 30s look tired when they're trying to prove something. Behind him was Nadine. She was wearing a cream blazer that probably cost more than my first truck. Her hair was perfect. Her nails were perfect. She looked around my kitchen the way people look at something they're already calculating the price of. "So this is the place," she said. "Not hello, not nice to meet you, just this is the place." I wiped my hands on my apron and walked over. "I'm Walter's father," I said, and then caught myself. Old habit. I'd introduced myself by my job title for so long that sometimes the real name came slower. "Sorry, I'm Desmond." She shook my hand with about the same energy you'd give a door handle. We sat down. Alec talked about the drive up from Toronto, the construction on the 400, some restaurant in Barrie they'd stopped at. Nadine looked at her phone twice before the soup was even finished. "This is a beautiful property," she said eventually. She said it the same way a real estate agent says it, like beautiful is a polite word for valuable. "Thanks. We bought it in '94. Marion always said it was too much house, but she was wrong about that." Nadine smiled the smile of someone who had already moved on from what you just said. "It must be a lot to maintain. Just you now." "Just me." "Have you thought about downsizing? The market up here has been—" She tilted her head slightly, like she was about to deliver generous news. "Surprisingly strong." Alec cleared his throat. I put down my fork. "I've thought about a lot of things," I said. "Downsizing isn't one of them." She laughed a little. Not unkindly, exactly, but the way people laugh when they think the other person doesn't quite understand the situation they're in. It just seems like a lot of space for one person. And you could free up a significant amount of capital, reinvest it, live comfortably somewhere smaller. I live comfortably here. She looked at Alec. He looked at his plate. I noticed, right then, what was happening. Not slowly, the way you sometimes miss things. I noticed it immediately and completely. The way you learn to read a room after enough years of working in places where reading the room was the difference between going home and not going home. She hadn't come to meet me. She'd come to assess me. The rest of dinner was pleasant enough on the surface. We talked about Alec's work. He was in project management at a firm downtown. Did well, seemed to like it well enough. Nadine mentioned, twice, that she had a background in real estate law. She mentioned, once, that they were looking at a condo in Yorkville that was a bit of a stretch, but absolutely worth it. She mentioned, once, looking directly at me when she said it, that wedding costs in Ontario had gone up significantly in the past few years. I offered more roast. She declined and said she was watching her carbs. After dessert, apple crisp from the Cortlands in the backyard. Alec went to use the washroom and Nadine and I were alone at the table for the first time. She looked around the kitchen again. Then she looked at me. Then she said in a tone that was somehow both casual and deliberate, "Alec says you're retired." What was it you did? I worked for the mine, I said. The mine. She repeated it like she was filing it away. What kind of mine? Copper and nickel mostly. Sudbury Basin. She nodded slowly. How long? 31 years. Another nod. And you're comfortable? Financially? I looked at her for a moment. In 31 years underground, I had worked beside men of every kind. Careful men, reckless men, generous men, men who would take anything that wasn't bolted to the floor. I had learned something about people in those years, not from therapy or books, from watching, from tight spaces, from situations where what a person was made of came out whether they wanted it to or not. I get by, I said. She smiled again. It was the same smile as before. Alec came back and we moved to the living room. She sat on Marion's chair, the wingback by the window, without knowing what it was, and I didn't say anything. I just noticed. They left around 9. Alec hugged me at the door and held on a half-second longer than usual, which I took note of. Nadine said it had been a pleasure and that the house had so much potential. I stood in the driveway and watched their taillights until they were gone. Then I went inside and called my lawyer. Not that night. I'm not an impulsive man. I spent 2 weeks thinking about it first. I went through the papers Marion and I had drawn up after her diagnosis, updated the beneficiary designations on the RRSPs, and had a long conversation with my financial advisor about what moving things into a trust would look like. I wasn't doing it out of anger. I was doing it because I'd spent 31 years making decisions underground where there was no room for wishful thinking, and I wasn't about to start now. When Alec called the following Sunday, I could tell he'd been coached on how to start the conversation. Dad, I just wanted to talk about. Nadine thought the dinner went well. She really did. She asked me if I was financially comfortable, I said. First time she'd met me. Silence. And she sat in your mother's chair. Dad. Dad. I'm not angry, Alec. I want to be very clear about that. I'm not angry, but I want you to understand what I saw. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said carefully, she's just practical. She grew up without a lot and she's very focused on security. That's fair, I said. A lot of people grew up without a lot. Doesn't give them the right to look at someone else's life and start calculating. She didn't mean it like that. Maybe not, but that's how it came out. We talked for 20 more minutes. He told me they'd started looking at wedding venues. He mentioned, in passing, that venues in the Toronto area were running anywhere from $40,000 to $80,000, depending on the guest count. He said they'd been hoping to have a conversation about, and here he paused, what kind of support we might be able to count on. I told him I'd think about it. I thought about it. What I thought was, I had bought this land with hands that were cracked and chemical burned for the last decade of my career. I had worked rotating shifts through 2 of Alec's birthdays and 1 of Marion's. I had breathed ground that would have killed a less careful man, and I had come home every time, and I had saved, and I had been careful, and I had put Alec through university without $1 of student debt. And now I was sitting in my kitchen being told, gently and with great tact, that the correct next move was to convert all of that into a down payment on someone else's dream wedding. I called my lawyer on a Tuesday. I didn't disinherit Alec. I want to be clear about that. The thought never crossed my mind. What I did was restructure. The house and the land went into a trust with conditions that were clear and simple. The property could not be sold, transferred, or used as collateral without the agreement of the trustee, who was not Alec and was not Nadine. My TFSA and pension went to Alec directly, as they always had. But the one thing Nadine had looked at and already started counting, the property, was, as of a Tuesday afternoon in March, no longer available. I didn't tell Alec right away, not because I was being secretive, but because I've learned, in 6 decades of being alive, that some information lands better after the situation has clarified itself. The situation clarified itself in April. Alec called on a Thursday evening and said that he and Nadine had been to see a wedding coordinator and that the venue they wanted, a restored heritage property north of the city, had a deposit deadline coming up. He said the total cost was somewhere around $65,000. He said Nadine's parents were contributing $20,000. Then he said, "We were hoping you could cover the rest, Dad." I sat with that for a moment. "That's $45,000, I said. "I know, but the property, you've got the equity. It's not like—" "I'm not pulling equity out of this house to pay for a wedding." His voice shifted. "Dad, it's our wedding. It's once in a lifetime." "I know what it is." We thought you'd want to be part of this." "I want to be at the wedding," I said. "I don't want to be the budget for it." There was a long silence, and then I heard Nadine's voice in the background, low and tense, and Alec said he'd call me back. He did call back, 2 hours later, and what he said, what I'm still thinking about, honestly, was, "Dad, Nadine thinks you might be holding on to things a bit too tightly. She thinks it might be worth talking to someone, professionally. Talking to someone professionally. About letting go. About the house. About Mom." I didn't say anything for a long time. "Tell Nadine," I said finally, "that I see what she's doing, and tell her that it's not going to work." He hung up. I put the phone down on the kitchen table, and I sat there for a while. The house was very quiet. It's always quiet in the evening, that time of year before the bugs come back, when it's still cold enough that you can hear the trees. I wasn't sad exactly. I was something more complicated than that. I was the feeling of watching a person you love make a choice you can see all the way to the end of. The weekend of a long weekend in May, Alec drove up alone. No Nadine. He sat at the kitchen table with his coffee, and he looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen on his face since he was about 14 years old, and had broken a window and was trying to decide whether to tell me about it. "I owe you an apology," he said. "You don't owe me." "I do. I let her—" He stopped, started again. "I've been letting her talk about you like you don't know what you're doing. Like you're just some old man who needs to be managed, and I didn't say enough. I kept thinking it was just how she talked, how she grew up, that she'd get better. But it's been 10 months, and she hasn't gotten better. She's gotten worse." I didn't say anything. I poured him more coffee. "She told me last week that the house was probably worth close to $800,000, and that if I could get you to agree to a reverse mortgage, we'd have enough for the wedding and a down payment on the condo in Yorkville." He said it flat, without drama. I told her that was not something I was going to help her do. I set the coffee pot down. "Good," I said. "She thinks you're—" He shook his head. "It doesn't matter what she thinks." We sat quietly for a few minutes. Outside, a pair of loons were calling to each other somewhere on the lake. I've always liked that sound. Marion used to say it was the loneliest sound in the world, and I always told her she had it backwards, that two things calling to find each other wasn't loneliness at all. "Did I tell you," I said, "how I got these?" I held up my hands. The scarring runs from the base of my right palm up to the wrist, and there are smaller marks on 3 of the left fingers. Old, faded now, but still there if you knew to look. Alec frowned. "You said it was a line break, some kind of chemical exposure." "There was a line break," I said, "but that's not the whole story." I told him. I hadn't told him before. Not the full version, because he'd been young when it happened, and then the years had passed, and it had become one of those things that you stop bringing up because the moment for it seems gone. It was February, close to 20 years ago. A junior miner on my crew, new, 22 years old, from a small town outside Timmins, his second month underground, had gotten his arm caught in a conveyor assembly during a partial shutdown. The shutdown had been early. He hadn't cleared the zone in time. By the time I reached him, the system had partially re-engaged, and there was hydraulic fluid spraying from a fitting that had blown loose, and the temperature down there was well below what skin could tolerate for long, and he was screaming in a way that I will not describe. I got him free. It took 11 minutes. I know because they timed it afterward. I don't remember it taking that long. I remember thinking about angles, about the fastest way to release the tension on the housing, about keeping his arm intact, about the hydraulic spray, about the temperature. I remember not being afraid. I don't say that like it's heroic. It was just how I was built. Some people freeze. I never froze. It was the one useful thing the work had given me. His name was Kevin Hartley. He kept his arm. He came back to work 8 months later, transferred to a different site. I hadn't thought about him in years. Alec was looking at me like he'd never quite seen me before. "I didn't know any of that," he said. "You were 12. You could have told me later." Maybe, but it felt like I stopped. It felt like something that happened underground should stay underground. That's how most of us felt about it. We sat with that for a while. "She never asked," Alex said eventually. He said it quietly, more to himself than to me. "You have scars on your hands, and she never once asked what happened." "No." He looked out the window at the lake. "I think I've been making a mistake." "I think you've been figuring something out," I said. "That's not the same thing." The engagement ended 6 weeks later. Alec told me over the phone, late on a Sunday night, his voice steady in the way that means someone has been crying and has stopped and has decided to be steady now. I didn't push for details. I told him that he'd done the right thing and that the room he'd grown up in was still his room, and he could come whenever he wanted. He came the following Friday and stayed for 2 weeks. We didn't talk about Nadine much. We fished. We fixed the dock, which had needed fixing for 2 years. We made bread together. I taught him the starter, the timing, how to know by feel when the dough was right. He'd never learned when he was young. He'd always been too busy. One evening near the end of his stay, we were sitting on the dock with the last of the light going down over the water, and he said, "She called me after. She said I was throwing away my future because I was too attached to the past." "What did you tell her?" "I told her I didn't think knowing where you came from was the same as being stuck there." I nodded. "Did I get that from you?" "Probably," I said, "though your mother would argue it's her." He laughed. It was the first time I'd heard him really laugh in months. It sounded like him again, like the kid who used to come home from hockey practice and eat everything in the kitchen and tell me every single detail of every single play. Not because I always had time to listen, but because he trusted that I would make time. I had made time. I had tried to always make time. The loons were out again, calling back and forth in the dark. That's the part I think about when I think about those months. Not Nadine, not the lawyer, not the paperwork or the phone calls or the moment Alec told me what she'd suggested about the reverse mortgage. I think about sitting on that dock in the last of the summer light, with my son beside me, listening to something call out and get answered. Marion used to say that you can't know what you've built until someone tries to take it apart. She was right about that, like she was right about most things. The house is still mine. The trust is still in place. Alec calls twice a week now, which is more than before. He started over, slowly, in the way that 33-year-old men start over when they've been paying attention to the right things. And every Sunday morning I take the starter out of the fridge, feed it, put it back, and wait. Some things are worth keeping alive. I've been sitting with this story for a while now, turning it over the way you turn a stone in your hand, not looking for anything specific, just feeling the weight of it. What I keep coming back to is not Nadine. She did what she did, and I don't hold particular bitterness about it. People who grow up without security sometimes spend the rest of their lives reaching for it in ways that damage everything around them. I understand that. I don't have to accept it into my home, but I understand it. What I keep coming back to is Alec. Because here's the thing about raising a child. You can work 31 years underground. You can come home every night with your hands erect and your lungs full of rock dust. You can put money away quietly and pay for university without saying a word about the cost. And none of that matters if you never teach the kid to read a room, if you never teach him to look at a situation clearly and ask himself what's actually happening here, beneath the surface of what's being said. I didn't do that well enough. That's on me. I modeled hard work, and I modeled patience, and I modeled keeping your head down. What I didn't model enough was the moment where you stop, look directly at something uncomfortable, and name it out loud. Alec had to learn that on his own. He got there, he did get there, but it cost him a year of his life, and very nearly cost him a lot more. I think about the 11 minutes I spent getting Kevin Hartley's arm free from that conveyor. I wasn't thinking about bravery. I was thinking about angles. I was thinking about what was true. The temperature, the pressure, the fastest path through. And I was acting on that, not on what I wished was true or what would have been more convenient to be true. That's what the work had given me, the ability to see a situation as it actually was, not as I hoped it might be. That kind of clear-sightedness is something you have to practice. It doesn't come from being cold or cynical. It comes from caring enough about the truth to look at it straight, even when it's inconvenient, even when it's your own son standing in front of you, and what you're seeing is a man who has been talked out of his own judgment by someone who understood exactly which levers to pull. The scars on my hands are not something I've ever been ashamed of, but I realize now I kept them covered, in a way, not physically, but in the sense of never explaining them, never letting Alec understand the full weight of what they meant. I thought I was being private. I think now I was being incomplete. A person who doesn't know where you've been can't fully understand what you're protecting, or why. When Alec sat across from me at that kitchen table in May and said he owed me an apology, what moved me wasn't the apology itself, it was that he'd gotten there through his own reasoning. Nobody told him. He looked at what was in front of him. He measured it against what he knew to be true, and he chose correctly. That took something real. It took the kind of steadiness that doesn't come from never being wrong. It comes from being willing to correct course when you finally see clearly. Marion used to say that integrity isn't what you do when people are watching. It's what you do at 5:45 on a Tuesday when there's nobody around and the easier choice is sitting right there in front of you. She was right. She was almost always right. The house is still here, the starter is still on the counter, and my son calls twice a week, which is more than he used to, and more than I ever thought to ask for. Some things take longer to build than others. That doesn't make them worth less.